scaring people with war, with poverty, all for the sake of victory. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán and his party are running an aggressive campaign ahead of Hungary's parliamentary elections, and politicians are manipulating the topic of Ukraine more than anything else. Will Putin's Hungarian friends manage to keep their positions? More on this in the following report.
There are still 3 weeks left before the start of the election race in Hungary, but in reality, the battle for votes has been going on for several months already, because this time Viktor Orbán, who has led the country for a long time, has a serious challenger, opposition figure Peter Magyar and his party TISA. In the face of fierce competition, Orbán has thrown caution to the wind. His campaign is full of manipulation, blatant lies, and playing on the fears of Hungarians.
If there's a pro-Brussels government in Hungary, young people will be sent to Ukraine. This is a real threat that we must prevent. We do not wish to send Hungarian soldiers, money, or weapons to Ukraine. We will not allow ourselves to be dragged into this war.
This kind of manipulation regarding Ukraine is practically the central theme of Orbán's speeches. He is a longtime friend of Putin and a like-minded ally of Donald Trump, an opponent of aid to Ukraine and its EU membership. Now, both the Prime Minister and his associates are openly claiming that Ukraine is supposedly going to interfere in the elections since it is interested in a change of power in Budapest. Ukraine's position on this issue was voiced by Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha.
By blocking Ukraine's EU membership, Orban is catering to Putin's demands and also hindering the establishment of peace in Europe. Today, Orban is acting like Hitler's accomplice, Ferenc Selassie. You should be afraid not of Ukraine, but of the Hungarians, who are tired of your lies, kleptocracy, and hatred.
Of course, where there's politics, there's talk about money. Orban says that hundreds of millions will be taken from Hungarians and given to help Ukraine. That's just another scare tactic. It has nothing to do with reality, because in fact, the goal is to attract investment to Ukraine. Interestingly, Orban's opponents, the TISA party, also don't support Ukraine's rapid accession to the EU, but Putin isn't their friend either.
We want a ceasefire as soon as possible. Russia's the aggressor. Ukraine is the victim. We respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and we're interested in having an independent neighbor at our border.
Orban calls the TISA party a puppet imposed by the West. Such accusations frankly resemble Russian propaganda. According to the latest polls, the opposition has the support of 51% of voters. Analysts believe that a victory by Peter Magyar would not lead to a radical change in sentiment in Budapest. They would rather be gradual. However, relations between Budapest and Brussels would definitely become constructive right away, and Ukraine would gain a predictable partner on its western border. Katerina Yurisieva, Podrobici, Inter-TV channel, United Marathon.
During his speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, without naming any names or countries, stated that there are people who are trying to destroy Europe.
Every victor who sustains himself using European money while trying to betray and compromise European interests deserves a sharp reprimand. And if he feels comfortable in Moscow, that doesn't mean we should allow European capitals to turn into little Moscows. We must always remember what fundamentally distinguishes Russia from all of us.
Zelensky called on European leaders not to lose vigilance because of the activities of internal destructive forces that undermine Europe's unity from within. Although the president of Ukraine did not mention any names, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán took Zelensky's words personally and responded sharply. He accused the Ukrainian leader of allegedly being unwilling or unable to end the war in Ukraine, and also described Zelensky's statements as carefully chosen offensive remarks. At the same time, Orbán once again emphasized that Hungary will not provide military assistance to Ukraine. Earlier, the Prime Minister of Hungary initiated a petition against financial aid to Ukraine from the European Union ahead of the parliamentary elections, which will take place in April 2026. Orbán presented these elections as a choice between war and peace, portraying Ukraine as a country unworthy of support and his own government as the only protection for Hungary from conflict and economic consequences. This is reported by Reuters news agency. Meanwhile, the party of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán is losing ground amid growing protest sentiment in the country. This is evidenced by recent sociological studies.
Today, EU leaders have to decide whether they are ready to use the frozen Russian assets for humanitarian and military aid to Ukraine. On this issue, the Hungarian Prime Minister sent a letter to Putin. Viktor Orbán asked the Kremlin dictator what Russia's reaction would be if the EU made a positive decision. But I received a promise that Hungary would protest. Moscow will take this into account. I was trying to figure out what would happen to Moscow's frozen money. Alexander Mudjichik.
Viktor Orbán reaffirmed his commitment to Moscow. On the plane on his way to Brussels, he said that he had written a letter to the Kremlin tyrant, asking what Russia's reaction would be if Hungary failed to block the transfer of its frozen assets to Ukraine. In response, Putin allegedly promised not to punish them for it. In addition, to appear as loyal to the Kremlin as possible, Orbán brought over 1.5 million workers to the European Union summit, pseudo-questionnaire, from the so-called national consultation. In them, Hungarians allegedly expressed opposition to Ukraine joining the EU and to Brussels funding Ukraine's resistance to Russian aggression.
I've never come to Brussels empty-handed, thanks to the national consultations. Here with me are the opinions of 1,600,000 Hungarians. We held one of the most successful discussions of all time. Its result is obvious. Hungarians do not want to take on any additional burden because of what? And they reject the EU's so-called radical policy of strict austerity.
Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiga, commenting on Orbán's statements, called him Russia's most valuable frozen asset in Europe. And Budapest constantly proves this. The day before, Hungary, the only European country, blocked the EU's annual statement on enlargement. The rest of the countries approved Ukraine's progress in meeting Brussels' requirements. As for frozen Russian assets, almost all EU countries are against confiscating the funds, but support using them as collateral for lending to Ukraine. Among the exceptions, once again, are Hungary as well as Italy and Belgium. In the accounts of the latter in the company Euroclear, there are 193 out of 210 billion euros frozen in the EU. The Belgians fear bankruptcy if Russia wins compensation through the courts, and they demand collective responsibility from all EU countries. So Orbán decided to support Belgium.
Euroclear is a Belgian company, and it's in danger. If the crazy ideas of the European Union about confiscating Russian assets are actually implemented, it will have an extremely negative impact on the institution. Here in Brussels, they disregard the rights of EU member states every day and push agendas that are destroying the European economy.
Hungary is a relatively small country, and its opposition generally won't prevent the EU from making a possible decision by qualified majority. The main problem is in Belgium.
The Belgians say, okay, everything looks fine for now, but let's not forget that Russia can and will challenge this decision in court. And most importantly, what will happen if sanctions against the Russian central bank are not imposed, for example, because of the position of Hungary or Slovakia, or if the final agreement between Russia and Ukraine does not include the payment of reparations by the Kremlin?
The US has stopped funding Ukraine, and Europe says there's no extra money, fearing an angry reaction from taxpayers. So they're looking wherever they can. For example, the British government has given Kremlin oligarch Roman Abramovich a final chance to voluntarily hand over the money from the sale of Chelsea. That's about $3 billion, frozen in Britain and Ukraine. Otherwise, these funds will be handed over to Kiev through the courts.
My message to Abramovich is this. Time is running out. Do it, make a commitment, and pay now. If you don't do this, we are ready to go to court to make sure every penny goes to those whose lives have been destroyed. Putin's illegal war.
But $3 billion is just a drop in the ocean. According to IMF estimates, Ukraine needs 135 billion euros for this year and the next. Today, EU leaders must finally decide whether they are ready to use the frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine. They already tried to reach an agreement on this at the summit in October, but failed. This is the last chance, according to German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, shares the same view.
I have proposed two different options for the upcoming European Council meeting. One is based on action, and the other is based on EU borrowing. And we will have to decide which path we will choose. But one thing is clear, we need to make a decision about funding Ukraine for the next 2 years, at this meeting of the European Council.
The first option from the European Commission is to collectively borrow the frozen Russian funds and provide them to Ukraine. This requires a unanimous decision from all 27 countries. The second option is a reparations loan. All frozen Russian assets in the EU would be moved to a single pan-European account and then loaned to Ukraine at 0% interest. Ukrainians would repay it once Russia pays reparations. Approval of the second option does not require unanimity. That's why, for Europe, it's the only real way to support Ukraine's viability in the face of Russian aggression over the next year or two.
In the end, the Europeans have come up with a pretty clever plan to issue zero-interest bonds, so-called reparations bonds, backed by Russia's frozen assets. These assets are guaranteed by the European Commission and the states, so they are considered equivalent to national bonds, sovereign bonds, like those of France or Germany, for example.
Although a qualified majority of EU member states' votes, meaning 15, is sufficient regarding the issue of frozen Russian assets, the decision is still up in the air. As the BBC writes, whether it is adopted or not, today the decision in Brussels will have far-reaching consequences, not only for Ukraine, but also for Europe. After all, if the decision is favorable for Kiev, the EU will show that it is ready to stand up to Putin's aggression even without US support. Oleksandra Muchachuk, Podrobity, Inter TV channel, Marathon. United News.